I think all of us know at least one person whose level of intelligence is something we kind of sit back and just admire. And when they speak, our capacity to listen closely and pay attention to those details is magnified. It's magnified because we know something valuable is coming. Some golden nugget of wisdom is headed our way. Well, good news for you. Today, you're going to get plenty of nuggets. Dr. Jeff Borden, or at least that is how he's been introduced in over 41 countries as a keynote speaker. He's a thinker. And fortunately for us, I was able to nail him down between speaking engagements and everyday business to share some of his hiring insights. So get out your notepads because Jeff, as I get to call him, doesn't just give interviews. He knows the behavioral science that makes this dating game more like eHarmony than Tinder.
There's this term called audience arousal, and while that sounds a little weird, it is the notion that the audience doesn't know what's coming next when it comes to your vocal inflection. They're going to be surprised pleasantly by the novelty of you changing up your vocal inflections. And I always tell my students, as your face goes, so go your voice.
You're listening to Glass of Water, where we reverse the role of the interviewer and the interviewee. The goal of this podcast is to pull back the curtain on the hiring process and give you some insights that equip you to land that career you want, rather than just some job you have. As is always the case, if you enjoy what you hear, please take the time to subscribe and give us a rating. So today I'm joined by a friend of mine, actually. Was a colleague first, became a friend, known him for quite a few years. Dr. Borden, I call him Jeff because, when you go back a few years with somebody, it's what you get to do. You don't have to call him doctor. Jeff has worn many hats since I've known him. Currently, he is the Chief Academic Officer at UCRU, and he's also the Executive Director of the Institute for Interconnected Education. Jeff, super thankful that you were willing to take time out of your super busy schedule to hang out on the Glass of Water today. So welcome.
It is my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm no longer parched.
So, Jeff, you've had kind of a varied life since I've known you. So I think it'd be good to get a little bit of your history so our audience knows some of the background because wow, you've done a lot of things, been to 41 countries, all these different states, presented all over the world. Maybe go through a little bit of your vita for me and fill me in and our audience on what you've been doing.
Yeah, you bet. Actually, before I do that, why don't I get just a little bit meta? Since this is a conversation about hiring, there's a book by David Epstein called Range. I highly recommend that anybody read it, but particularly people who are looking for a job change or a new job or a first job. It really discusses the importance of generalization and not necessarily just focusing on one specific thing, which unfortunately many places in our culture today encourage you to do. But he goes in and makes a really strong case for the notion that people who specialize too much shoot themselves in the foot most of the time. So with that in mind, I have tried very hard to create a generalist experience in my life. I speak all over the globe. And I think one of the reasons I'm asked to come back over and over again is because I speak about topics that are general and I try to bring them all together into one salient point or concept. I'm also known as an instructional designer. I have hired, managed, run, performed instructional design, or really, as I like to call it, learning design these days. I've been a vice president at companies, at schools of higher education, universities. I was the chief innovation officer at St. Leo University. And so again, speaking of books, I think it's really important for people who are looking for jobs to explain not just their background, but how it underpins theories or other experts out there. So, Innovator's DNA, The Innovator's Dilemma, those are some staples that are on my bookshelf. And when I go in and start talking about possible future careers that almost always involve innovation, I certainly want to talk about the things I've done innovatively with education technology and creating experiences for people. But I want to tie that back to other experts like Clayton Christensen, Jeff Dyer, some of the real giants out there that I'm standing on their shoulders of. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. I think we all stand on the shoulders of people who've gone before us and have charted paths, and we've benefited from it. And hopefully, as we learn and grow, we add to that, and then somebody maybe can stand on our shoulders at some point in time.
Certainly would be nice to see it while you're alive, but if not, it's good to know you left some sort of legacy.
Absolutely. So one of the things I just want to ping you on here, which I've always thought was fascinating, was you're a comedian.
Yeah, so I did an open mic night when I was in my first year of my master's program. This was many years ago, and it went well. And it was a Wednesday night. They invited me to come back on Sunday and do 3 minutes, which was actually harder than it sounds because everything I had done was really off the cuff. And so now I had to plan 3 minutes. I worked that into being able to do Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays pretty much every weekend throughout my master's. And by the time I was done with about 2 years, I had 12 minutes of material. So that seems crazy to some people. That's actually part of why I don't do it full time. I'm not one of those guys that just comes up with the funniest material instantly. But it was fun, and I still dabble in it today.
Yeah, I think that speaks to the concept you shared with right from the beginning, this idea of understanding a lot of different industries, a lot of different spaces. When you branch your mind out and don't specialize in one place, it allows you to think differently in all of those spaces because your brain isn't pigeonholed, right? There's some synaptic paths firing in your mind, helping you to strategically solve problems that you probably couldn't have solved otherwise because of just those other spaces that you've lived in and tried and experienced. Not to mention the fact that recent books or podcasts that I've listened to have pointed to the importance of doing a lot of different things to really learn what you are good at and what you want to be able to do. So again, the hiring process, interviewing, trying to find a job, it's important to experiment and try new things. Don't think that the first thing you do is something you need to stick with for the next 20 years. You want to branch out and learn new things.
One of my favorite things to do with the books that I read, and I'm a voracious reader, I like to try to puzzle them together and figure out where there's overlap. And if you look at range and then you look at the innovator's DNA, Jeff Dyer in the innovator's DNA suggests that the key to innovation, which is very, very different than creation, invention. Invention is brand new. You've never seen it before. Innovation. The heart of innovation is really this concept called associative thinking. And associative thinking suggests that you've got to take a solution or an idea from one context and then place it in another context and use it, make it work. At the heart of range is you need different experiences in order to really flourish. And what's happening is you're using ideas and solutions from other contexts within your own. So there's really a wealth of books and theories and things out there that suggest this principle for anybody who's trying to make it in the world today. More and more entrepreneurial stuff is suggesting you need more experience rather than less. That it's not just about myopically focusing on one thing and only being good at that one thing. That doesn't work for most people.
Yeah, more experience doesn't mean more experience of the one thing. It means more experiences of other things that then can all be brought together. Certainly agree with that. So getting back to the whole hiring and firing, but we're going to talk about hiring. We're going to talk about firing. The whole hiring interview process, that is something that you have been engaged with over the course of your career, correct?
Very much. So I have hired individuals that I was going to manage. I have hired 1, 2, and 3 levels below what I manage. I have been on presidential searches for universities. I have consulted with universities about how to hire presidents and provosts. So I have really hired at almost every level you can imagine, or at least been a part of a search committee that did that.
So since you have this massively broad range of people you have been in the room with, asking them questions and trying to build out your team or teams under you, so you have this wide range, all these different levels. Are there key things that you're always looking for regardless of the level? So when you're hiring somebody, maybe give me 2 or 3 things you're like, no matter what level they are at, these are consistent.
Yeah, the top 3 are pretty easy for me. I'm constantly searching for people who I believe show that they can think critically. So they're problem solving, they're connecting the dots, they're taking, one question and molding it or morphing it into a second question, those sorts of things. I also want to know that I've got someone who can be autonomous. I'm a big believer in working remotely, and often the teams that I'm dealing with, they have remote positions. So I need to know that a person is motivated, self-directed, that they're able to be autonomous. And at the same time, and this sounds strange to say, but I need someone who's collaborative. I am also a big believer in the concept of interdependence. I think more jobs are interdependent today than they used to be. Back in the 1970s, if the research is right, most people worked in parallel to one another, sort of like 3-year-olds play. They don't really play with each other, they just play close to each other. Today, that's not true. You have to do your job or I can't do mine. So I need people that have really those 3 traits: critical thinking, autonomy, and collaboration.
If those are what you're looking for, how do you find those during the interview process? Or is there a technique you use? Is there a special sauce that you have people take that helps you know? Was there some magic pixie dust you throw around? I mean, in all seriousness, I'm sure you have some strategies that you employ during the interview process to kind of pull that information out of those candidates. Maybe you could share some of that with us.
Absolutely. One of my go-to methods is based on the concept of hiring slow, firing fast. I really want to bring people in, and I want to have them interview not just with myself, but with the people that they're potentially going to work with obviously whomever is going to be their manager, whether that's me or someone else. I want them to be introduced to and have a conversation with people who are my peers or potentially their peers, but not in their division. So I really want to make it a portfolio of interviews and then gather that team together, whether it's through a survey or on a quick chat or in a meeting, and ask for feedback. How did they get along? What were the conversations like? Where did they go? At the same time, after a person has run that gauntlet, we want to bring them in and have them give some kind of presentation. And I have done this for every position that I have hired for if I was in charge of the search. A lot of people think that that's just something that you do with a person who's going to be presenting on a regular basis. My argument is everyone presents in some way, shape, or form at some time, even if it's just back to their own team. So we want to know that they can critically think as they put together that presentation. Is it logical? Is it reasonable? Does it have credibility? All the things that you would look for in a presentation. We want to see what they can do when they present to us. And that also includes the questions, the interviews that we give them following that presentation to follow up. We can really tell a lot about how they fit into the team and how they think based on those two experiences.
Do you find that candidates are afraid of that?
Yes, it's not lost on me as a public speaking professor that it is the most feared thing that our society seems to say, hey, this isn't good for you, when in reality, it's crucial. So, I think my students have a leg up in this regard, but you can really see the pain on people's faces when you tell them this is what they're going to have to do. Now, they all do it, but it's definitely something that I would encourage people to prepare for in a job search, because I hear more and more managers doing this kind of search.
So what advice then would you give a candidate who you know is applying for a job and that job is going to require them to put together some sort of presentation? What advice would you give that candidate as they are preparing?
I would go back and look at your public speaking courses you took in high school or college. They actually do give some pretty good information. Unfortunately, I think our culture is such that we take a class and then forget that class within hours of the final. And I think in this case, that's a bad idea. But the big keys to giving a good presentation: timing, audience analysis. What do they want to hear? What do they need to hear? At the same time, you want to leverage nonverbals. And then you want to, of course, have a message that is credible, reasoned, logical, and passionate.
Yeah, the leveraging nonverbals, I think, is interesting. I was talking to a gentleman not too long ago about the hiring process, and he was speaking to a person's body language that they present when they're in that interview and how that says a significant amount about their passion and interest and even their mindset while they're in that interview room. So giving a presentation, I'm certain, just builds on that same concept, because really when you're in the interview, you're presenting to some degree, not a strategic, thought out presentation, but still you are presenting.
So this really ties back to, again, my home discipline. My first degree was in communication, and my master's thesis was in semiotics, which is nonverbal communication. So I look very, very closely at people's nonverbals. The ones that people can practice, it amazes me how often they don't seem to have practiced that. You know, eye contact, it's a big thing. And it's amazing to me how often people look at their shoes, they look over the shoulder of the person they're talking to. They just don't use culturally normed eye contact. At the same time, I look for openness. When someone is sitting in front of me with their arms crossed and their legs crossed, that really is telling. Whether they know it or not, what they're signaling is that they're hiding something. Then you start looking at how their vocals, which is a nonverbal characteristic, it's called vocalics, how your paralanguage actually follows your facial expression, follows your gestures. So when you have vivid gestures and facial expressions, your vocal inflections will be higher and lower. They will be faster and slower, which is what you want. There's this term called audience arousal. And while that sounds a little weird, it is the notion that the audience doesn't know what's coming next when it comes to your vocal inflection. They're going to be surprised pleasantly by the novelty of you changing up your vocal inflections. And I always tell my students, as your face goes, so go your voice.
I had a student come up to me recently, and they were nervous about an interview they were getting. That was a phone interview. And it was all that was offered. And she asked me the question, so what should I think about? What should I do during the phone interview? And I hopefully gave her some advice that you just shared with us, which is very similar. You need to act like you're face-to-face with that person when you're actually having that phone interview. Use your hands. Emote just like you would one-on-one. And that comes off through your vocal inflection as you're having that conversation. So I think what you just said makes me feel a lot better that the information I shared with that poor little student was correct.
Well done, Professor.
I'm learning. We're all learning together, right? Hey, so candidates are coming in for interviews. Do you think there are some common misconceptions that people come into interviews with that you'd advise them to, hey, don't worry about or think about these things before they arrive?
Yeah, there's really two that I would suggest here. One, I want to give a person who's trying to get a job with me the ability to show me that they can take control. I encourage my teams as they interview people, and I do this myself. I try to be very vanilla and just sort of lay out some questions and give them an opportunity to start to really show that they can take control of the situation. I think a lot of interviewees think they have no control, and that shouldn't be the case. Now, control is not the same thing as just barging forward and doing whatever you want. That's not what I'm saying. But I want to see that they're going to take control of the situation. I want to see them refer back to things that have happened already in the interview. I want to see them control that context and show me that they really can be the master of a situation, like I hope that they will be when I hire them. So that's one. The second thing that I would say is behavioral questions are something that I think most interviewers employ these days. They don't just want to hear your answer to a question. They want to know an example of a time you actually leveraged that solution or found yourself in that context. And so one of the things that I also look for, and this is something that interviewees absolutely have in their control, is the ability to share behavioral answers with me, even if I haven't asked a behavioral-based question. So I will get to that. I usually put those fourth, fifth, sixth, as the fourth or fifth question in the interview set, and then I start doing behavioral questions. But at the start, I do not, because I'm interested to know if they're going to go back to experiences they've actually lived, things they've actually done, and then share those with me. And that's what I'm hoping for.
So it sounds like one of the other questions I wanted to talk to you about today was what gives candidates in the interview a bit of a leg up as you're talking to them. That could be one of those things where the candidate is responding to your non-behavioral based questions with experiential references to activities that they've had in their life and how those apply to the question that you asked.
Absolutely. So let me give you two candidates to sit before a hiring committee, a manager, whomever. If one of them has asked the question, are you a hard worker? Their response is going to be, yes, I'm a very hard worker. I believe in hard work. Good for you. The second person who says, yes, I am a hard worker, let me tell you about a time that we had a deadline. It was a week away, and I spent an extra 90 hours that week at the office because we had to reach that deadline. Now, I took a day off when we were all done because my boss said that was okay, but I made sure that we were going to hit that deadline by staying late, extra hours every day, and I worked the weekend. Which one of those two candidates do you think you're going to remember at the end of the day when it's time to hire?
Yeah, for sure. Obviously, the person that's telling the story. I mean, it all comes back down to experiential narratives, telling a story that highlights your competence. And so when you're asked a question about, are you a hard worker? How do you feel like working on teams? Any kind of closed-ended question or even open-ended, the more times you have an opportunity to respond with your story, with your experience, the better, for sure. Do you think, Jeff, that you actually talked about this earlier, nonverbal cues, so how you present yourself during that interview. Are there some nonverbal cues that you in particularly look for that help a candidate stand out in your mind?
Well, the ones I mentioned, absolutely. Eye contact, facial expressions, gestures, nonverbals, vocal inflection. I also look at how they appear. I am a big believer that you want to dress for success. That said, I want to know that they looked a little bit into the organization that they're coming into. If somebody shows up in a suit and this is a jeans environment, that tells me that they don't know much about the culture here. They didn't do some investigation that I would have hoped they would have done. Now, if that person in the jeans environment comes in for the job and is wearing khakis and a button-up, a little bit nicer than most of the people in the room, perfect. That tells me a little bit more about that person. So again, because semiotics is such a big deal in my life, I look probably more closely than most people do. My employees used to talk about something that they called the creepy eye theory. where I would look to see what would happen if I looked at their left eye versus their right eye. Would they look away or they keep looking at me? And it has to do with dominance and neuroscience and other things that don't really matter. But I really do look at nonverbals a lot. But some of those things are things that people can absolutely prepare for.
So with that thought in mind, are there like significant red flags that you know pretty quickly that if a person does that, it just kind of sets you off or puts you in the mindset of, yeah, I'm now looking for negatives from this person because they did this one or did these one or two things?
A couple of things. Yes. The eyes are the window to the soul. The reason that your mom knew you were lying to her when she asked where you'd been last night was often because of where you looked. I make sure to leverage in my interviews a chance for people to really go back and take a look at, it's called visual indexing. Take a look at where their eyes go when I ask them certain questions so that I know if they're making up an answer or if they're remembering an answer. I also will pay as much attention as I possibly can to facial expressions. There are 7 universal facial expressions: anger, happiness, disgust, things like that. And when you ask people certain questions, the very first thing that happens, it's called a micro expression. And it's very, very difficult to mask. So I will pay very close attention to a person's facial expression the second after I ask them a tough question and try to see where they're going with it. If they look pained or if they look, pleasantly surprised that I asked a question that they can answer well, I do pay attention to those things. And then, as I mentioned earlier, closing your nonverbals is really not a good idea.
I'm processing the information you give me, and I'm thinking to myself, I am so glad I'm not interviewing with you right now. Just because your brain is so wired to notice so many things because you're into the psychology of it. And so you do pick up on a lot of those smaller details that I think some other hiring managers might not be aware that they're actually picking up on. You actually are aware of them. So even though you are highlighting them as this is why I look at this, I think other people are doing that without knowing the why. Those micro expressions you were talking about, I've read about them a number of times, and people just do that instinctively. I might not know that you're going to be disgusted, and because you gave a micro expression, but I know the back of my brain is thinking, something's wrong about the response that's going to be coming.
These are absolutely culturally normed, and you're right. Most people intuitively understand this, but they don't necessarily know why they understand it. They'll say, I have a feeling about that person. She didn't seem this or he didn't seem that. What they're probably getting at are some of these things that I'm trying to consciously look at.
I had a person I spoke with a number of months ago, and this individual highlighted the fact that you want to leave the interview with not maybe having answered everything super technically accurate, because that interviewing or hiring manager doesn't remember all the technicals, but they'll have an emotional impact. So they'll remember more of the emotions that happened during that interview than they're going to remember all of the cognitive things that were shared, all of the technical aspects of that interview. And so if you can walk away and they have a positive feeling about Jeff, oh man, I really like that Jeff guy. Maybe I don't know why I can't put my finger on it, but I liked him. A lot of that is because of this lizard brain, back of your brain working and giving you these intuitive insights into that individual.
That really ties back to what I've been talking about with regard to control. I agree with everything you just said, 100%. So when a person connects with myself or the other members of the search committee or their peers or whomever they're interviewing with, they're probably connecting on multiple levels. Yes, non-verbally, they are probably finding what is called immediacy. Non-verbal immediacy is an openness that is perceived by the receiver. So they probably have that, but they also probably have shared some stories. And if they're really good, They have shared stories and or anecdotes or examples that tie back to things that the audience finds meaningful. So they've asked a question or two along the way. You know, why did you ask me that? Are you a cyclist? You sound like you're a cyclist. Oh, you are a cyclist. Well, you know, I happen to be a cyclist. And then later in the interview, they bring up an answer and they tie it back to cycling. Well, all of that stuff is connection. And that shows, again, someone who is taking control of the interview and saying, I'm not just going to answer your plain question with a plain answer. I'm going to back it up with some evidence, some credibility, but also some connection back to your life that's going to help you remember me.
For sure. I think often as a person going into the interview, we assume there's not much we can control. So much things are out of my control in this interview, but that's not the case. And we need to cognitively be aware of the things we can control and take control of them to give us the best opportunities to be successful during that interview process.
Absolutely. And you will know when you come out of it, how you feel is basically, did you do this stuff?
Absolutely. So Jeff, what is it? What is the go-to, the back pocket slammer that you throw down during the interview?
My favorite question to ask, and I believe I've asked this in every interview I've ever given, is simply this. What question or questions did I not ask you today that you think I should have? First of all, it amazes me how often people cannot answer that question. I am just giving you on a silver platter an opportunity to brag. And most people hum and haw and say, I really have no idea. Your questions were so thorough. Well, no, they weren't. Tell me what I should have asked to make you sound great. And if you've got something that you think I would have asked about this kind of position, I want to hear that too. That lets me know, again, critical thinking, that you're a problem solver. So that's my favorite go-to question. I ask that near the end of every interview.
You've shared that with me in the past, and because of that, I'm formulating my responses all the time. Like, if I ever get asked this question, what am I going to say? So thanks for that, Jeff. So that gets us kind of to the final part of Glass of Water, Jeff, where I'm going to prompt you with just a few questions here. I call this the advice you give. So I have a couple different bullets here of the advice you give different types of people in different situations. So we'll start at the top. What advice would you give the person going out to get their first job?
Be confident while not being arrogant and not being timid. Be confident.
I like that. What about this one? What advice would you give the person writing their resume?
Make sure that the resume is catered to the position that you are applying for. Generic resumes are obvious. And a good friend of mine named Jeff Lee showed me the power of making sure that resume is also designed very well. That it's nice looking, laid out well. You've really taken the opportunity to guide a person through the document rather than just hoping that they find the nuggets in the document.
Appreciate that. Visual matters. The visual matters. All right. Final one, Dr. Borden. What advice would you give on a person looking for a job making use of social media?
I would give two pieces of advice. One, be careful what you post. There are hiring managers who seek out your social media profile. And so even if it's just personal and you think it has nothing to do with business, a hiring manager or an HR person won't necessarily think that. So be careful. At the same time, I think you can actually use social media, and after you've developed a network especially, to ask people, hey, where are the places I should be looking? What kinds of companies should I be looking at? Are there any groups hiring right now that you, my network, would know me best and say, hey, you'd be a good fit there? I think that's an excellent crowdsourcing strategy for finding work these days. Obviously, you can only do that in certain contexts. If you're in a job, you don't want to be doing that. If you don't want your current boss to know you're looking. But you can absolutely use social media in very unique ways. And I think there's some clever stuff to be done.
Yeah, I think owning your brand and your reputation is what you're talking about. It's what you post is going to be an indicator of who you are to some audience somewhere. So if you have an opportunity to own that, it's better than letting somebody else own it for you.
Quick story about that. When I was at Pearson Education, which they at the time called themselves the world's largest learning company. And so I had a tremendous reach. I was blogging a great deal. And I had a lot of followers. I posted a blog, this is now 12 years ago or so, about something that was fairly political and fairly controversial. My boss and the head of HR came to me and said, never do that again. They said, we don't want to be associated with a side on this. And in fairness, I was representing them in the blog. It wasn't my own personal blog. Although even if it had been, it was good advice. And ever since then, I think you would be pretty hard pressed to tell what my political affiliation is, where I fall on certain controversial topics, because it's just not germane to what I do. So if it is germane, if it's controversial about education, it's fair. But if not, I pretty much try to stay away from it.
You took control of your brand, didn't you?
Tried.
Jeff, I am so appreciative of the time you took today on our podcast here. I know that you're a world traveler. Trying to get in touch with you sometimes is like pulling teeth. I'm like, where's he at now? Oh, he's in Berlin. Oh, he's in Australia. He's all over the world. And so I know that this time was not easy for you to make, and I appreciate your willingness to be on the show.
It was absolutely my pleasure. What a great way to get some information out to people who are looking for work and potentially looking to move up. And if I could help, wonderful.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. Take care.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to Glass of Water. We hope you were able to pull a few bits or nuggets of helpful information. And hey, remember that regardless of where you are in your career search, it's not about what you do that matters. It's about who you are. Could I get you something to drink?
I would like a glass of water. Is that how we practiced it?
That's how we practiced it. That's exactly right.